are outraged by the greed, the recklessness, and the illegal behavior that they have seen from the masters of the universe on Wall Street. Through their outrageous behavior, these financial tycoons, many of whom have earned hundreds of millions of dollars, if not billions of dollars in their career, have plunged our country and much of the world into a deep recession, which has cost our people millions of jobs, which has cost people their homes, which has cost people their savings, and which have led millions of Americans to wonder what kind of future their kids are going to have. And all of this is not the result of an act of nature. It is the result of very definitive actions by a small number of people on Wall Street who have shown outrageous greed in their behavior. Madam President, it goes without saying that we need a major investigation to understand how we got into this disaster and what we are going to do to get out of it and whom we are going to hold accountable. It goes without saying that we need to begin the process of re-regulating Wall Street, bringing back Glass-Steagall, and making sure that our taxpayers will never again be put in this position of having to bail out the greed on Wall Street. It goes without saying that we have got to address the issue of too big to fail. In my view, and I've said this many times, if an institution is too big to fail, it is too big to exist, and we should begin right now in starting the breakup of these mammoth financial institutions whose failure would cause systemic damage to our entire economy. It goes without saying, Madam President, that we have got to do more than worry about Wall Street. We've got to start worrying about Main Street and the middle class of this country. We need to pass strong mortgage reform legislation as well as legislation to protect the American people who are paying outrageously high interest rates on their credit cards. And in that regard, I have introduced legislation and hope to get it to the floor of the Senate before too long, which would put a cap of 15% on the interest rates that any credit card holder in this country would be charged. But, Madam President, those issues dealing with Wall Street and many more will have to wait for another day. Today, I am offering, along with Senators Feingold and Senator Webb, a very simple and what I believe is a non-controversial amendment, which I hope will have the support of every member of this body. Madam President, as you well know, the Congress voted to provide $700 billion in so-called TARP funds to help bail out some of the major financial institutions in our country. I happen to have voted against that bailout, but what is very clear is that every penny of that TARP bailout money is now public. As part of that bailout legislation, what was mandated is that every financial institution that received 1 penny of the taxpayers would be listed on the Treasury Department website, and if any American wants to know where that $700 billion went, they can account for every nickel of that. And that is the way that it should be. Madam President, on the other hand, what many people do not know is that the TARP funds, that $700 billion, was only one part of the bailout. What many people do not know is that the Federal Reserve has lent out over $2 trillion to a number of financial institutions. But, Madam President, if you were to ask me or any member of the United States Senate, any member of Congress, any American who received that money, what they will tell you is, we don't know. Over $2 trillion of taxpayer money has been placed at risk, but the American people don't know who received those funds and what the exact contractual arrangements were. Madam President, anybody who believes in the concept of good government, anybody who believes in transparency, understands that that is wrong, that that is unacceptable, and that that has got to change. Madam President, earlier this month, I had an opportunity to ask Ben Bernanke, who is the chairman of the Federal Reserve, about this issue when he testified before the Budget Committee, of which I am a member. At that hearing, Chairman Bernanke told the Budget Committee that since the start of the financial crisis, the Fed has provided loans to, quote, hundreds and hundreds of banks, end of quote. But Mr. Bernanke declined to name any of those banks, how much assistance they were provided, or what, in fact, those banks are doing with the money that the taxpayers gave them. Madam President, what the Federal Reserve needs to understand is that this money does not belong to them. It belongs to the American people. And the American people have a right to know who the Fed is lending taxpayer money to, how much they are getting, and what the Fed is asking in return for this money. I cannot imagine anything that is more obvious, more common sense. How can you put $2.2 trillion of taxpayer money at risk and not know who is receiving that money? Madam President, I think back now to the financial reform, to the financial forms that members of Congress have got to fill out. People want to know, are we in a conflict of interest? We fill out those forms. They are made public. Our staff members fill out those forms. In many, many instances, when people are applying for federal aid, they are forced to make public what they are asking for and how much. Some years ago, small farmers in the state of Vermont received some help from the federal government as part of the milk program, if I recall correctly. There it was, right in the newspaper, every nickel that struggling farmers were getting. Some of these farmers make $20,000, $25,000 a year. Some of them are on food stamps. And there it was, $8,399 goes to this farmer and that farmer. They were not happy about it. That's what the process was. So it seems to me that if small farmers in Vermont are going to see what they get from the federal government and help to keep small farms alive in this country, I think that multi-billion-dollar financial institutions should also be asked to have what they have received made public as well. Madam President, the amendment that I am offering today is a pretty simple one. It amends an amendment that I offered and was accepted in the Budget Committee. And specifically, this amendment calls for increased transparency, including naming which institutions received assistance from the Fed, how much money they received, and what they are doing with this assistance. I sincerely believe that this is not an issue of left versus right. In fact, some of the strongest supporters of this concept are very, very conservative people. People like Ron Paul, colleague of mine in the House, a former colleague, supports this type of approach. And a number of Republicans have spoken up for increased transparency as well as progressives. So that's the issue. It is as simple and as clear as it can possibly be that if taxpayers are going to be placed at risk by providing trillions of dollars in loans to large financial institutions, the American people have a right to know who is receiving that money and what the terms are. This amendment, once again, is supported by Senator Feingold and Senator Webb, and I would ask my colleagues to support this amendment. And I thank the President and would yield the floor.
Who yields time?